Hey, IB History Scholars, it's Mr. Newcomb. I want to continue with my discussion here on the American Civil War. I want to focus on the time period known as Reconstruction. And so that time period for Reconstruction in the United States is really 1865 to 1877. So about 12-year time period after the U.S. Civil War. As we do move into Reconstruction, some of the groundwork was already being laid out as the war was progressing, especially in regards to slaves. And I did mention in a previous recording that at the Battle of Antietam, it did give Lincoln the courage to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Before that Emancipation Proclamation was issued, there were already some type of emancipation measures occurring. Simply, we called them confiscation acts here. And so in 1862, Congress had passed a measure on confiscation, which gave the U.S. military authority to confiscate property. And slaves were viewed as property, so it gave the Army the ability to confiscate slaves. And in turn, some of those slaves became contraband forces and put into the field to either do support work or actual fighting. Lincoln's view on emancipation began to change in 1862 from a gradual to a full emancipation. And you could see that as a result of the Battle of Antietam, where the proclamation was preliminarily issued in September of 1862. In many ways, it was going to give the United States time to adjust to it and kind of process it and see where to go from there, but also send a message to the Confederacy and to the global community about the intentions as well here. Reaction, of course, it was mixed, both in the United States, in the Confederacy as well. Some people in the United States didn't think it was a right measure to do, but Abraham Lincoln still went ahead with it. Confederacy just simply ignored it. And for the international community, the mixed results as well. But ultimately, when we look at its impact, it does change the war aim. Moving from not only preserving the Union, but also creating a new sense of freedom. Freedom for the country, but more importantly, freedom for those that were enslaved. Now, the proclamation was a war measure, and so when the war got over, that meant that proclamation ended. And to clarify with that proclamation, the proclamation only applied to areas in the Confederacy that still was fighting against the United States, that the United States hadn't conquered. And so that reduced the number of slaves that were free, but still a very important measure. So to make it permanent, you had to pass the 13th Amendment. And so the Senate passes it in 64, the House passes it in 65, and later in 1865, the states also ratify it. And so Lincoln's big war measure, big statement in this conflict becomes a reality, and so therefore Lincoln is sometimes viewed as the great emancipator as a result of that. Okay. Now, how to put this country back together, it comes down to who really has the authority to put this country back together. Is it the Congress? Is it the president? Does the defeated Confederacy have a role in it? It's going to be really a power struggle between the U.S. president and U.S. Congress. Now, Abraham Lincoln, he's going to get assassinated in April of 1865. So we don't quite know fully what his plan would look like. But here are some things that we do know about Abraham Lincoln and Reconstruction. He felt Reconstruction was a presidential concern. and he was going to create the principles of Reconstruction. And there was going to be some military governors to help in this process. So that meant somewhere in the South that it was going to be broken up into districts, and governors were going to run it until it met a certain criteria. Part of that criteria was known as the 10% plan. 10% of the 1860 electorate who had voted took an oath of allegiance to the United States, and those states abolished slavery were going to be brought into the Union. A plan that was also being thrown out there by Congress was the Wade Davis bill. That was a little bit more stringent than Lincoln's, and that was called the 90% plan, or the 90% of the electorate would have taken oath of allegiance, and a few other steps in that process. Lincoln vetoes it because he really felt like this needs to be a speedy process. We need to be lenient, and if we're going to be able to move beyond this conflict, got to heal the wounds quick. All right, all that is taken off the table because he is assassinated in April of 1865, and that really changes the nature of Reconstruction. Now, his successor is Andrew Johnson, and he was a former senator from Tennessee. He did not go back home during the war because Tennessee had seceded from the Union, and he really felt that this conflict was brought on by the plantation elite, and he was not part of it. He did feel, though, in the same note that Abraham Lincoln, that Reconstruction was an executive prerogative here and was not a legislative function. His plan, a little bit more spelled out than Lincoln, but this could be what Lincoln's plan might have looked like as well. But again, we don't really know. But still, Johnson's plan here was simply an easy process. Amnesty to all Southerners who took an oath of allegiance, except high-ranking officers and officials. Remember, he felt they're responsible for the war. Revoke ordinance of secession, so basically go back and undo what they did in 1860-61 after the presidential election. Repudiate the Confederate debt, so don't pay it at all. Ratify the 13th Amendment. Got to acknowledge slaves are free. But he falls on the old states' rights argument that if freedmen are going to get rights, it's up to the states to decide. So that really kind of opens up the door for the old system to be reestablished here. All 11 states met the requirement, and he felt restoration was complete by December of 1865. Okay. Well, that's not how it ends up happening here. Congress is going to find a way to become a powerful check to the president. And Congress was not pleased with what the southern states, how they responded to everything. They did not recognize the new governments in the South because they didn't feel they met the criteria of respecting now freedmen and some of the rules that they were beginning to pass, like black codes. And elected Confederate officials and officers were not admitted. Some of them were so brazen to show up in their old uniform, and it's their prerogative. They said, nope, you can't sit in your seat. And of course, black codes. Black codes replaced the old slave codes. These are early Jim Crow-like laws trying to control how now the freedmen can live in the South here. And so they do take over really Reconstruction. Part of this Reconstruction plan, a series of civil rights types laws are going to be passed here, and amendments are going to be passed during this time period, like the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment of 1866, which deals with citizenship question, one of the first times that we actually defined who a U.S. citizen is. In 1866, it passes Congress and becomes the 14th Amendment officially in 1868 when the required number of states pass it to ratify it. Okay, they do put together a committee on Reconstruction to develop a new policy, and this new policy is going to look like this. Military Reconstruction Acts of 1867 is passed, and it's going to set up 5 military districts with the exclusion of Tennessee, because Tennessee had ratified the 14th Amendment as well as the 13th Amendment and changed their state constitution, so Congress felt they were okay. So 5 military districts are set up, and to be readmitted, southern states would accept black suffrage and ratify the 13th and 14th Amendment. Basically make them do that, even though when they do become laws, they're supreme laws of the land, force them to ratify them. And slowly over time, they will simply do that. And so eventually it's like they have to, if they are going to become vibrant, productive states, it'd be very difficult for them to be isolated. So eventually they will. So by 1876, all the states have been readmitted into the United States. Some of them a little bit earlier as well to that. Reconstruction will become very contentious. That our first president to become impeached, or at least charged with impeachment, is going to happen here. Andrew Johnson will get impeached. 1868. Some think it was very political. Congress had passed the Office of Tenure Act, and Johnson did not follow it. And when he fired Secretary of War Stanton, so they bring him up on impeachment charges. They also didn't like the fact of how he was running Reconstruction and impeding their measures as well. So it became just a political hot mess here. And when the trial was held in the Senate, at the end of the trial, Andrew Johnson is not impeached, but really, realistically, he's politically neutralized, excuse me. All right, so Reconstruction now is going on. And when we look at Reconstruction in the South, between 1868 and 1871, all the southern states had met the congressional stipulations and had rejoined the Union. Okay. And so I think earlier I might have said by 1876, realistically by 1876, the states have rejoined the Union, and a group of a political group in the South known as the Redeemers, or the conservative Democrats, have taken control again of all the ex-Confederate states here. Now, for Reconstruction to happen in the South, there needs to be a number of players to participate in it. And so there is going to be a group of Northerners who do go down to help reconstruct the South, and we'll call them carpetbaggers. You can see about 2%. There are going to be Southern Republicans. These could have been individuals that were part of the old Confederate government, now cooperate, or these could be people looking outside of the old Southern political system and now have an opportunity to get involved in it. And so we'll call them scallywags. That's not necessarily a nice word because it usually refers to as traitors, but you can also refer to them as Southern Republicans. And then the black politicians themselves there. Some of them, again, were maybe freed blacks coming south, or they could be ex-slaves now finding themselves involved in the political process. All right, and there's going to be some mixed success for them as well. Politically, the 14th and the 15th Amendment is going to be very critical for freedmen in the new reconstructed South. It's going to give them citizenship. The 15th Amendment is going to give them the right to vote, so now they're part of the political process. And so they can have a role in determining what's going to happen to them. The economic reconstruction of of the South, it's a complete restructure of it altogether here. The expansion of the infrastructure here, bring the railroad system online, rebuild the bridges, make rivers more navigable, start building some roads and some ways to make it feel a little bit more connective. The textile manufacturing does grow, so they still are dependent on cotton. Cotton still is going to be king here, and sharecropping. Sharecropping is going to replace the old plantation system, and sharecropping is it's going to set up a almost a perpetual system of debt for the freedmen or people who engage in that type of agriculture. Small gains in heavy industry here, in that some cities like Birmingham and Richmond and Atlanta are going to start becoming industrial centers here. So it's going to be slow, but there is going to be some gains there. When we look at the social side here in the Reconstruction, families are reunited here. When it was the plantation system, it was very common for families to be broken up, sold to different plantations. Now, after the war, it was about reuniting these families and also legalizing the marriages that has occurred. Education opportunities was going to be critical here for the advancement of the freedmen, and so you do start seeing schools being created here, as well as what we might begin to call the historically black colleges are going to be set up, and institutions set up for the advanced learnings of the freedmen here. Black churches are going to be very, very critical. They're not only just a place for spiritual worship, but it's a community center. The minister, the priest, the clergy, going to be very important here during this time period, and as we also see in the 20th century in regards to the civil rights movement. There is going to be a group that decide, the South is not for them anymore, and they will leave and go out west, and they might get the name as exodusters as they move on to the plains. Some of them go to Kansas because that's where John Brown had been there during Bleeding Kansas time. Some even go into northern states, cities like Chicago, cities like New York City, greatly expand as a result of this exodus. And that exodus is going to continue all the way into the 20th century. We might call it the Great Migration. Now, one knock against the Reconstruction in the South here, that's a pretty big knock, is the corruption and the inefficiency. And so there are some historians that kind of focus on that and show why Reconstruction is a failure, but there is some success, and I have mentioned some of those successes there already. But corruption and inefficiency happens. Patronage, once people got in political power or in positions of power, they gave jobs, they gave resources to people that they knew. Bribery was, I wouldn't say rampant, but there are plenty of cases where you can make a claim that bribery had led to the corruption and inefficiency of some of these Reconstruction governments. Huge debts and high taxes seem to plague these Reconstruction states. High debts going all the way back to the Civil War time, and high taxes. In a case they're not maybe used to a tax, high taxes, because they didn't exist, and now in order to build the infrastructure, to build the schools and all that stuff, taxes need to happen here. And then there was one very important measure known as the Freedmen's Bureau, and the Freedmen's Bureau did a really good job of bringing families together, providing opportunities, but it was underfunded and understaffed, and so it could not meet the needs and the demands of not only the freedmen, but also any Southerner who may have gone to that institution for some type of assistance. So Reconstruction in the South, one overall big takeaway is it's mixed. There's a mixed success here. Now, what is going to undo Reconstruction is the old order. All right, the ex-Confederates staged a counter-revolution here, and they did that through legal means and violent means. The Redeemers were the conservative Democrats. They were going to try to find ways to take control of their local and their state governments, as well as influence the national government by getting people elected to Congress. And they also, part of this counter-revolution included terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, which was created in 1866, and they're going to use terror to try to intimidate freedmen from voting, from becoming very active in their community, prevent any Northerners who might want to cooperate with freedmen or any of the Southern Reconstruction governments, to intimidate Southerners from also cooperating as well. And they proved to be very, very effective until President Grant exercises the Force Acts, which in a moment I'll get to that. And then you had the Mississippi Plan, which was basically the blueprint on how to take back your government. And that was through the legal and illegal measures, and other states would have something very similar to the Mississippi Plan. And the Force Acts here of 1870 to 1871, they were designed to eliminate the Ku Klux Klan, and heavy penalties for those using force, bribery, or intimidation, reduce the Ku Klux Klan terrorist measures. But again, it may have reduced it, but the violence and the intimidation is going to continue, because there are plenty of other organizations out there that did something very similar to the Ku Klux Klan. But right now, the federal government during Reconstruction is beginning to lose the political will to want to continue to engage in Reconstruction. There are a number of other issues that is occurring in the United States, and starting to draw attention away from Reconstruction. All right, and I did mention that new paramilitary groups begin to pop up as a result of the Ku Klux Klan being taken down by the federal government with the Force Acts here, like the White Leagues and the Red Shirts, and so that violence and that intimidation is just going to continue. In many ways, it continues into the 20th century. The Southern Republicans were divided ultimately over this as well, economic and social policies. And I think many of them wanted to focus more on the economics and not on the social policies. And the Northern Republicans, they weren't really interested anymore. They are hearing from their constituents, it's time to move on, it's time to focus on some other things that's going on with the country. The United States will suffer a series of economic panics or downturns, depressions, however you want to call it, in the 1870s, that it's ultimately going to contribute to the undoing of Reconstruction as well. So when we look at the end of Reconstruction, you can see it's starting to unfold, especially in the 1874 congressional election, when the Democrats gain control of the House. So now Congress begins to show little interest in helping Southern Republican governments, kind of beginning to abandon them and let them try to find their best path to now move forward. Grant's administration, moderate efforts towards Reconstruction. Grant himself was very sympathetic, but he is working in an administration that has been plagued with scandals, and so that hurts his effectiveness. And now he's working with a Congress that's not really interested as well. The Amnesty Act that does pass does restore rights of ex-Confederates, about 150,000 of them that were excluded in the 14th Amendment. It was a measure to help reconcile, and the Freedmen's Bureau is allowed to collapse. And so there's not going to be any more funding with that. So that institution is now gone. There are economic crises that are happening in the United States. So uh, those measures or those events now are taking precedent. And then you have the political crisis of 1876 to 77, which was a presidential election in which there was questions over some electoral votes. And so a committee of 15 was put together to figure out how to solve this issue. They didn't bring it to the U.S. House for a big vote. It was a committee of 15 came up with it. 8 Republicans, 7 Democrats. In the end, Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes wins the presidential election of 1876. The Democrats accept that. In return, the federal troops are removed out of the South, and there weren't that many of them there remaining, but any remaining ones are removed. And the federal oversight of Reconstruction really is done. There will be some continual aid packages being sent out to some of these states, but realistically, it ends Reconstruction. So now that allows the southern states to create their new order, and part of that new order is racial separation that's created as a result of Jim Crow laws. And so that's my conclusion for the Reconstruction.